Trigger warning. This story contains descriptions of child abuse, exploitation, and family betrayal. If you are triggered by these topics, please consider pausing now. Resources and hotlines are listed in the description below. They told me it would be for my own good. I was 10 years old. I say that sentence now and people lean in, expecting a monstrous stranger, a shadow in an alley, a stranger's hand. They imagine the worst in the worst possible place. What surprises them, and what I want you to understand, is that the person who handed me away was the woman who used to braid my hair and warm my hands by the stove. The person who sold me was the one who hummed lullabies and taught me how to peel potatoes without cutting myself. I'm sitting on my porch as I tell you this, the same way I used to sit beside my mother when I was small, swinging my legs and listening to the clink of her cup against the saucer. There are geraniums in chipped pots, a kettle on the stove, the whole slow comfort of late mornings where nothing urgent presses at the door. The garden smells like thyme and sun-warmed earth. It makes the memory worse and better at the same time. It teaches you that a life can hold both cruelty and beauty. When I close my eyes I can smell that kitchen and the coffee that burned on the edge of the pot, and in the same breath I can see the thin hand passing money across a palm, like a coin dropped into a well and swallowed. Before I tell you everything that followed, let me take you back to the beginning, to the kind of small town where everyone knew whose cow wandered into whose yard, where children learned to mind the road because the mail truck was the only fast thing on the map. My town, Maple Hollow, sat between an old river and a stretch of pines. It had one grocery store, a post office that doubled as a place for gossip, and a school with 2 rooms and a bell that rang for recess. We never had much. Our house was small and cold in winter, but my mother filled it with hums and stories and the kind of love that made you think hunger could be survived with jokes and a slice of bread. My name is Julia, though nobody called me that at first. I was Jules Juju, the littlest of 3. My father left before the crying stopped. I never heard the explanation that made sense, just a door and a silence. My mother, Maria, worked cleaning other people's houses and sweeping the diner at night. She could be all laugh and light when the day was good. She could be sharp and quick when the bills piled up and the baby's cry kept her up. She loved me the way someone tends a plant, with hands that didn't always know what else to do, but with devotion. I learned early how to read the edges of the day, the way my mother's laugh came shorter when a man stopped outside our gate, the smell of cigarettes that lingered even after the visitor left, the little jar where coins were kept for emergencies. At first, the absence in the house was the kind you could name with a shrug. "We'll make do," she'd say, and we did. We learned to sew patches over knees and to boil down soup until the flavor was familiar. We learned to find joy in the small warm things. A lemon left over from a neighbor, the thrill of a library book that smelled like paper and promises. But the thing that stole our easy definitions of love and care came slow and soft, and then all at once. It started with a bottle that appeared in her bag, not the clinking, obvious kind that you can smell across a room. This one was wrapped, hidden at the bottom of a grocery sack, taken out in the dead hours when the children slept. She would drink and then be different, tender for a while and then gone. Gone the way a tide takes sand and leaves the shell. It was as though a second person lived inside her and borrowed the voice I knew. The bills grew heavier. She began to forget to pick me up from school. She lied sometimes when neighbors asked where the money went. I remember seeing her hands tremble like a bird's wings when she tried to count change. I do not tell you this to excuse the thing she did. I tell you because it matters that I loved her and I watched her fall. It matters because love makes betrayal sharper. We had moments that still make my throat tight with shame and longing. Once, on a summer night that smelt of cut grass, she braided my hair and pinned a flower behind my ear because a traveling circus was stopping in town. She danced with me in the kitchen, and for an hour I thought the world would always be small and kind like that kitchen. Later, when the bottle sat empty on the counter and her head bowed over the sink, the same hands that braided me had no answer. Love does not nullify responsibility, but it complicates how you remember what happened, especially when the perpetrator is your mother. Poverty is not just lack of money, it is the slow erosion of options. I was 10 when my mother began to change from the woman who hummed to the woman who negotiated with men in doorways. There were whispers in the store about debts, about a loan that came due. The landlord, Mr. Yuva, Anders started to look meaner. He used to nod to me when I passed his porch, but then his face grew hard when my mother came by to ask for extra time. People in town started to look away more often. I learned quickly that poverty can make the people you love barter with the things you carry inside yourself. The day she sold me is etched into me like a burn. The morning began like any other. Frost on the porch, the kettle still warm from the night before, the ache of a cold that hangs in your bones. I remember the way the window caught the light and threw it in a stripe across the floor, the sound of the milkman yelling, and a crow settling on the fence. My mother seemed distracted, her movements quick and needle-like, as if she had a thought she could not catch. There were bags packed with clothes, only a single small bundle for me, though I did not yet know that packing is sometimes the same as handing you over. When I look back now, I see 1,000 small betrayals leading to that moment. The neighbor woman, Mrs. Connolly, had been to our house a week earlier and left with a hush. A man named Crane came around more often. He wore a winter coat even when the sun was honest and had a way of smiling at my mother like she was a problem he could solve with money. At first he offered work. "I can take her on to help where I keep my house," he told my mother, and she laughed too quickly, relief flickering in her eyes. "They need help at Cold Springs," he said. "There's always work. She'll be better off." These are the ways it is soft, how language is used to wrap harm. The words, better off, a place to go, helping hands. They made a transaction sound kindly. Mother looked at me and said, "Jules, this will be good for you. You'll earn your keep." I remember how she pinned my coat and kissed the top of my head. Her hands smelled like soap and the coffee we had not been able to afford, but had made anyway that morning. She wrapped my scarf around me twice, as if she feared the cold would bite harder than anything else. There were coins on the table when the man left. I do not know how much or how few. I do not want to place a number in your head because numbers make it feel clinical when it was anything but. It was a small heavy thing that fit into the pocket of her apron and burned a path into the palm of her hand. She slid it into the jar that was for emergencies and did not look at me. The last look she gave was like a child's, apologetic and afraid, and it tore me. I was 10, and I believed that if I was brave I could fix things. I did not yet understand that people trade pieces of each other when they are desperate. I was taken to a house in a town that smelled of engine oil and wet tar. The family who took me in, Mr. Crane's sister and her husband, had a big kitchen and a locked pantry full of jars and pickles. The man who opened the door wore work boots and had the smell of metal on him. The woman who said hello had a face like a tight white sheet. She looked at me with the kind of measurement that weighs me like wood to see if it's fit for fire. They were not monsters like the ones the movies give us. Their cruelty was the quiet kind, structured and unembarrassed. They were people who had needs and bills, and the economic habit of looking at a child as a way to fill a roster of chores. The work began immediately. I learned the cadence. Wake before dawn, sweep, scrub, fetch water, cook until my hands ached. I learned to be invisible. The house had rooms with high ceilings and light that smelled like lemon oil, but there was no warmth in them that belonged to me. The house taught me rules. If I spoke in the wrong tone, they would scold me. If my fingers were slow, the scolding came harder. Once, after I spilled soup, Mr. Crane slammed his hand on the table in a way that made the plates jump. He did not hit me, but the force of the gesture taught me the terror of being small in a world where other men took the shape of thunder. There were other children who came with other transactions, young, older, with names I learned to keep to myself. We exchanged small things like a secret language, a nick in a wooden spoon, a folded paper where someone had written home in sloppy letters. We stitched one another's cuts and shared apples when the pantry door was left unlatched. The most dangerous part was the hush. We were told not to speak about where we came from, about the woman who had given us away. It was as if speech itself would wake something cruel. At night, I lay on a mattress so thin the springs whispered like insects beneath me. I would press my face to my knees and remember my mother's voice. You accumulate little holy things when the world is cold. A leftover button, the smell of lavender from a neighbor's sachet, the bruise the sun made on your skin through the window. I had a scrap of my mother's scarf tucked in my sleeve. At the time, I did not know whether to blame her or to miss her. I missed her more than I had any right to, because children misplace blame like they misplace toys. They do not see the hands that move the pieces on the board. There were nights when the woman of the house would call me close and ask me to water her plants. She would hand me a cup and say, almost in apology, "You're a good worker." I understood those words then as currency, like a coin you could spend for a little kindness, but kindness in a house like that came with a price. To be kind was to be useful. Once when she found me crying after a long wash, she tapped my cheek gently and said, "You'll get used to it. This is how life is." She did not wrap her arms around me. She could not perhaps afford the softness I craved. I became very good at small resistances. I learned to hide under beds when the house filled with men who used their voices like ropes. I learned to wake before the others and stand on the stoop, counting the stars until the sky paled. I learned to keep my anger small and coiled like a spider under the edge of the rug. I took to stealing minutes to read library books smuggled in by a boy from the mill who ran errands for Mr. Crane. Those pages became a kind of medicine, maps of other lives I could imagine myself into, letters that taught me the shape of words and the way sentences could be used like ladders. Once I found a paper with the word court on it, folded in a pocket of a coat someone had left hung by the back door. The word looked like a foreign city. I did not yet know the way courts smelled, the metal of gavel and leather of folders, but I liked the idea that there were places where people went to ask for things to be made right. It felt like a thin light under a door. Soon enough, the house grew meaner. The chores increased to the point that my small body ached with the kind of tiredness that lingers in your bones. The man of the house began to drink and to speak of moving us to the fields, or worse. One night, after the clock had been put away and the house hummed with the soft noises of sleep, I overheard a conversation about moving on and getting less trouble. The tone of their speech made a stone fall into my stomach. They spoke of my future as if it were a thing to be packaged and sent. My child brain made maps of what moving on meant. Darker rooms, strangers, the smell of diesel and cages. That night, I held my mother's scarf so tight the fabric went white under my fingers. I whispered the song she used to sing and tried to imagine the kitchen again, the small patch of sunlight on the floorboard. You learn a lot of grown-up things quick when you are 10 and your world smells of oil and pickles. You learn to make yourself small, to anticipate a hand before it strikes, to calculate the days until a face at the window will change. I thought often of telling someone. There was a postman who sometimes sat on the step and chewed his tobacco in the afternoons. He had a way of looking at the world as if he was counting things people couldn't see. Once I told him what had happened in a half-whisper. He did not slap my hand away, but he did not arrest the moment either. He tipped his hat and said, "Child, these are dangerous streets. Keep your head down." The people who might help were the same people who could look away. That is the loneliness of these kinds of betrayals. The world makes room for the thing that has been broken by soft indifference. There were small resistances that kept me alive. There was a hollow in a fence behind the stable where I hid a little scrap of bread for the mice. There was a place under the porch where rain pooled and made a perfect glass that reflected the moon. Once a week I would steal a sliver of time and stand under that moon and swear to someone I could not see that I would not quit, no matter what my mother had done, no matter what the men said. That oath was a brittle thing. It was the only real thing I owned then. And then the danger tightened like a fist. The man of the house, Mr. Crane, came in one late autumn afternoon with a friend I had never seen. Their talk was clipped and careful. They moved about the kitchen like men arranging chess pieces. I was told to scrub the cellar floor that day, a place where the light never reached and where the air was always cold. As I kneeled, my hands in the cold water, I heard them say the words, "Another place, and no papers, and less noise." My throat went dry. The smell of the cellar was like the smell of old clothes you haven't washed in a long time, sour and heavy. That night, they locked my door from the outside for the first time. I banged until my palms stung. I cried and called my mother and heard nothing but the house swallowing sound. I curled under the thin blanket and thought of all the times my mother had hummed to me, and I could not decide whether to scream because she had failed me, or to whisper a prayer that she might come to me and tell me this was a dream. The darkness became a thing I could measure in breaths. Something odd and small happened then. A boy from the neighboring house, the one who delivered packages, slipped under the window and passed me a note folded into the shape of a heart. The note said only, "If you can get out, go north to the bridge. There is a woman who helps." The script was jagged and hurried, as if the writer had been watching to see if anyone looked. I slid the note under my shirt and felt its sharp edge against my ribs like a secret. I had no plan, only the raw hunger of fear and a child's stubbornness to not be erased. The next morning I waited until the light was right, until the man had lumbered off to the market and the woman had gone to hang shirts. I slipped out beneath a loose board in the back where the ground was soft and the nettles were thinner. My legs were wet. My shoes were thin, but I ran. I ran like I had been practicing for an escape that I had not known I needed. The first thing that hit me was cold. The river at the edge of town was swollen with recent rains. It smelled like iron and wet stone. The second thing that hit me was the sound of a dog barking far away. The third was the recognition that I had no one to go back to. You do strange things when you are 10 and frightened. You make bargains with God, with the wind, with the idea of your own future. I kept picturing the kitchen. I kept picturing my mother's hands. Every step away felt like a cut, every mile like a release. At the bridge, I sat shivering and clutching the note like it was a talisman, and then the woman came. She smelled of tea and warm wool. She had a face that held 1,000 small mercies. She asked my name, and I told it like a child might offer a secret. She wrapped a blanket around me and fed me bread, and then she asked, "Do you have anyone to call?" And I shook my head. The woman, her name was Ellen, did not ask where I had come from in the way that people who did not mean to help ask questions. She simply took me in the way a boat takes cargo without making a fuss. She had a small kitchen that hummed with pot steam, and she clucked at me like a mother. There were others there, a teen who had run from an uncle, a woman who worked nights and had learned how to stitch broken things back into life. They gave me a cup of something that tasted like cinnamon and told me to sleep. When I finally closed my eyes, it was with an ache so deep I thought it would never leave. It was not only the physical cold or the hunger. It was the shape of betrayal. A mother who had traded a child for something she wanted badly and could no longer refuse. I lay in that borrowed bed and thought about the jar on my mother's shelf, the coins, the way she had said, "You'll learn." I wanted to hate her with the whole kind of hatred kids can hold, but I also wanted to run to her and scream until she woke and remembered the smell of coffee, the feelings muddled together like wet paint. I stayed with Ellen for a little while. She wrote down where I had come from in a small ledger and told me people who could help would be told. She did not promise the world, only the next step, food, a bath, a person who would sit beside me and not flinch. I remember sitting at her table, hands wrapped around a warm cup, and feeling something like the memory of safety move through me. It was small and fragile, like a moth that had landed on my palm. But the world had a way of catching up. The house I had run from put out calls, quiet inquiries to neighbors, to the postman, to anyone who had seen a child leave. My mother, according to what Ellen said in a low voice, had been seen in the market holding the money she'd been given, counting it twice as if counting could make the pain less. She walked through town like someone trapped inside a loop. I realized then that my leaving would not be secret forever. The web of small-town life had a way of tugging at loose threads until they were all connected. That is where my story pauses in the telling. At the bridge, with my shoes still wet and the note in my pocket, held in the palms of a stranger who had given me a blanket and a place to sleep. I had broken free from one house only to step into another world of unknown rules, and in that breath between the two, I felt fear and a possibility of something like hope. I did not yet know the shape of the legal things that would come, the detectives and their careful questions, the medical rooms that would smell of antiseptic, the long slow work of remembering without being broken by memory. I tell you all this because the part that follows is not simply about law or punishment. It is about what happens to a child's heart when the person who should protect them becomes the source of peril. It is about how small acts, notes, the kindness of a stranger, the courage to run, can become the scaffolding of a life rebuilt. If this story is hitting you, if you recognize threads of your own life here, if you believe survivors and want more stories like this, hit subscribe. Stay with me. There are more pieces of this to come. The long walk toward justice, the nights when I had to stand up and say things aloud so the world could hear, and the years of work after that, where I learned how to plant a garden that would not be plucked away. For now, I keep the memory of that night in the hollow of my hand. I will tell you how the town turned, how paper and ink and the slow patience of people who refused to look away made a way forward. I will tell you about the trial rooms and the way a judge's voice can make the world feel either tiny or big. I will tell you about the days I went back to a woman who had sold me and the words I said to her. But first, I need you to know how it felt to be a 10-year-old with a coat tied around her waist and a note folded in her pocket, standing on a bridge with the river roaring beneath and a future as uncertain as cloud. The rest of the story lives in the next doors, in the detective who wrote in careful handwriting, in the neighbor who had watched but chosen to stand up, in the small hospital room where a nurse took down my name. It lives in the way I learned to call myself by my own name without the echo of shame. It is a long story, and tonight, under the light of the lamp in my little house, I can already see some of the roads ahead, the ones that will lead to courts and to therapy rooms and, ultimately, to a garden like the one I sit in now. For now, though, I will let you sit with me on that bridge, feel the wind, and breathe the scent of the river, because in that breath I learned something crucial, that escape is not the end of the story, it is the start of telling it. Ellen tucked the blanket tighter around my shoulders and brewed another cup of that cinnamon tea, and while I sipped, I felt the world tilt just enough to let a shape of safety slip in. She did what people who mean to help do. She did the small, steady things first. She fed me, she washed the grit from my hair, she sat with me at the kitchen table and let me name the smells that had been following me: oil, pickles, the river. Naming them felt like taking away a little of their power. That evening she took out a thin ledger from beneath her loose floorboard and opened it with fingers that had stitched up 1,000 hems. She wrote my name slowly as if learning a new letter. Then she made 2 calls, one to a woman who worked with a small advocacy group in the next county and one to a detective in the town where I'd lived. Ellen didn't dramatize it. She simply said, "There's a child at my door." The way she said it made me feel like a thing picked up, not a sentence to be argued over. Detective Harris arrived the next day. He smelled of rain and old leather, and asked questions the way someone would read a map without making you walk the rough parts out loud. Gentle, careful, with pauses where you could put your breath back into your chest. He listened while I told him about the jar of coins, about the ache of my mother's hands when she counted change, about Mr. Crane's kitchen that always smelled of lemon oil. He wrote slow things down, and then asked if I could point to the men I'd seen in the market and at the gate. For a long time, I thought the police were another kind of grown-up who could look away. I'd learned that lesson early, that adults had a limit to how much they would carry for you. But Detective Harris did not look away. He took Ellen's ledger and asked for names. He made notes about Crane's sister and about the neighbor who'd slipped me the note. He asked about the note I'd hidden under my shirt. I pulled it out like a relic, its creases soft as a secret. He folded it and put it in a bag the way a man wraps things he plans to keep whole for the telling. They took me to the hospital first, because there are protocols for children who come from places where anything could have happened. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and paper gowns and the small click of a pencil being sharpened. A nurse, quiet and kind, asked me my date of birth and my mother's name and offered me a toy that was a small stuffed lamb. I held the lamb for the parts of the exam that felt like other people's hands were the hands of strangers. It was a small anchor. The doctor, Dr. Patel, asked me where I had slept, if I had been beaten, if there was anything that hurt. I said the truth, but not everything. There are things that a child stores in pockets that only open years later. Ellen and Detective Harris collected pieces of evidence that seemed ridiculous in their ordinariness. A scrap of my mother's scarf, the jar with coins that had my mother's fingerprints on the rim, a receipt from a market where Mr. Crane often paid. Things that, put together, built a map of the transactions that had traded a child like a commodity. Ellen's ledger had columns for dates and notes. Left town, paid for work, one child moved. In small letters, she had written the name of a man who'd come around too often. The ledger was a kind of truth that didn't tire or forget. It sat on Detective Harris's table like an accusation with ink as teeth. The town is a net, and in small towns nets have holes and knots. People whispered, people shook their heads. There were those who said my mother had nothing and had done what she thought needed doing. There were those who called it unforgivable. There were people who did not want to be implicated in something they'd suspected but had not spoken about. I watched the faces of the women at the grocery store as the news spread like a wind that wants to make itself warm and then bites instead. They arrested Mr. Crane's sister first. She was found in that house with the locked pantry and the jars of pickles. She had a look of someone who had normalized small cruelties so long that they fit like a second skin. She denied knowing where I'd come from at first, because that's what people do when they are given the choice between being on the right side of law and being on the right side of their own needs. But the ledger and the testimony from the boy who smuggled books for me, he was small and fierce, made a rope that found its way around their denials. They questioned the man who had called himself Mr. Crane. He had a throat that worked like a machine when he lied. I remember watching Detective Harris across the room take a breath and say, "We have a statement that puts the child in your care." It was a simple sentence that sounded like a verdict even before the court arrived. My mother, Maria, was alive in town, moving with a slump that had nothing to do with the weather. Detective Harris found her in the market. He asked her to come to speak with him. She did. She had the hollowed look of someone who has been emptied out by need and then told to be full. Ellen and a social worker sat with her, set a thermos of tea between them. They did not shout. They said things like, "We want to know where Julia is, and we want to help." I remember the moment she put her hands to her face and began to cry in a way that was animal in its grief, both remorse and terror. She kept saying, "I had no choice," in a voice that wanted the words to be a shelter. There are ways the law meets need, and sometimes the meeting is clumsy and painful. They arrested my mother on charges that were unclear to me then. Neglect? Endangerment? But the point is that a line had been crossed and the system had finally recognized it. For my part, I was given a temporary home with Ellen, and then with a foster family who smelled differently than the house on the hill, more of lemon oil replaced by the warmth of bread. The social workers explained things in slow sentences. There would be hearings, there might be criminal charges, evidence would be examined. The words hummed like radiostatic in my chest. I was a child in a grown-up story. Months later, when the case went to court, the procession of grown things felt archaic and enormous. The gavel, the bench, folders of paper, the low murmur of people who had worn the weight of bureaucracy for a long time. The courtroom held light in a way that made everyone look like an outline someone had colored in with a single pencil. Members of my small town were there, some in support, some with their hands folded over their mouths, as if speech could make the day retreat. Detective Harris sat one row back, his jacket folded over his knees like a blanket. Ellen came with the ledger in a plastic folder. The boy who had given me library books sat behind us, his chin proud, and his hands clenched around the strap of his bag. People often imagine a single dramatic day where justice is delivered in a burst. The truth is different. Trials are made of pauses and papers, of witnesses who stand and speak and are cross-examined, of little things being hammered into a shape that makes sense to those who read law for a living. I remembered the ledger being held up like a relic. The prosecutor read entries out loud. January 12th, money given for help with house, child moved to Cold Springs. The voice in the courtroom had a flatness meant to hold pity at bay. Ellen's handwriting, slanted and sure, became the spine of part of the case. When I was called to the stand, I felt the old ways of being small try to take over. My mouth wanted the comfort of silence, the safety of shrinking, but something hard had been seeding in me for years, an ugly, bright thing called resolve. I had made a pact with that moon beneath the porch. That oath had not withered. I walked to the stand and looked at the judge, his face a practiced neutrality, and then at the faces in the public gallery. My mother sat several rows in, her face worn as if someone had tried to iron all the expressions from it. I swallowed and started to speak. "Please state your name for the record," the clerk said. Julia Ramos," I answered, each syllable like a small stone I set down so I would not drop them all at once. "Where were you living in November of last year?" the prosecutor asked. The question landed like a pebble in a pond, and its ripples became everything. "In the house on Hollow Road, with Mr. Crane's family." They asked me about the day I left, about the note, about the coins. I spoke of the jar, and of the way my mother's hands had trembled when she counted, and of the man who offered work with a smile. The defense tried to make my memory look like a bad dream. "Is it possible you misremembered?" they asked, as if memory were something to be cross-examined. I clutched the edge of the stand until my knuckles whitened and said, "I remember the window and the kettle and the scarf." Memory is stubborn, and it has a way of defending itself when you put your hand to it. One of the most wrenching moments was when the prosecutor showed a scrap of paper. The heart-shaped note folded in a boy's rough handwriting. They asked me to read it aloud. If you can get out, go north to the bridge, there is a woman who helps. I read and felt the sentence like a map forming in my chest. The short, jagged lines of that boy's pen were now a route to a life that would not be owned by other people's debts. The testimony of neighbors and the boy from the mill tightened the case like a vice. Mr. Crane's accounts, his pocketbook, they all bent toward evidence. In the end, the jury deliberated in a room that smelled like coffee and the kind of air you get in spaces where decisions are heavy. When they returned, a stillness fell like a curtain. The verdict was read. The court found Mr. Crane's household culpable for exploitation and child endangerment. They were ordered to pay fines, and faces that had been stern in the courtroom softened like wax in a lamp. My mother's case was more complicated. Addiction complicates culpability in the eyes of many. She was given a sentence that included mandated treatment and a period of supervised release. The judge spoke of rehabilitation in a voice that tried to be kind and firm. I will not pretend everything was repaired by that single verdict. A piece of me had been given away, and the law could not stitch it back to the exact place it had been. But the legal recognition mattered. It named what had happened in a language that matters in the world. Theft of a child, exploitation, neglect. Naming is part of healing. It does not put the pieces back the way they were, but it makes sure people cannot walk past the hole without seeing it. After court, my mother went away for a matter of months into a program that mixed prison time with treatment. I would see her at visitation in a place that smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant. She would cry and say, "Jules, I was hungry," as if hunger could explain being sold. I asked her once why she had done it, and she looked at me like she was trying to find a place in the room where truth would be less sharp. "I wanted to save us," she said. "I thought I could fix the bills and keep us safe." There are answers that sound like excuses, and there are apologies that are only light. Her voice trembled with regret that was not entirely hooded in remorse. Forgiveness is a complicated work. For a long time, I could not feel it. Some days I thought about forgiveness as a thing other people wrote about in books, an ideal, while the rest of the world required hard, unromantic steps, therapy appointments, housing meetings, letters to caseworkers. I learned to measure progress not by sudden absolution, but by the steady accrual of small, real things. An appointment kept, a bill paid without panic, a lunch shared that did not come with the taste of fear. Therapy was a place I did not want to go at first. What could they say that Ellen in the summer nights by the river couldn't, I thought. But therapy, Dr. Lee's office with its bookshelf and the plant that always leaned toward the light, was where I began to name the ways my body remembered things my mind had tried to keep tidy. The first sessions were mechanical. "Tell me what you remember," Dr. Lee would say, and I would hand her pieces like loose coins. Over time, she taught me how to hold those coins without bending under them. She taught me grounding exercises, a method of counting things in a room, of touching textures, of naming 5 things you can see. These were not miraculous, they were practical. They were like learning to walk with a new leg. The nightmares remained for years. Sometimes I woke in the dark, and the room would feel like the cellar where the light never reached. Slowly, with months and then years, the nightmares lost their grip. They became smaller. The edges dulled. Things that once had the sound of thunder became the sound of rain. Some things, though, do not leave. There are scars that are the color of memory, and they remind you not to forget. I learned the small rites of repair. Ellen taught me how to keep a ledger of my own, not of transactions, but of my days. It was odd at first to write down lunches and errands and good small things, but it slowly created a rhythm. A chain of ordinary days that, when sewn together, began to look like stability. I learned to tend a small garden in her backyard. We planted marigolds and thyme and a stubborn tomato bush that refused to give up even when the heat was unkind. Tending those plants taught me a curious patience, that growth is quiet, and it often happens underground before anyone sees the green. Years passed, and things accumulated like slow sediment. I finished school the way children in unstable houses are taught to do, by hunkering down and finding a rhythm. I worked odd jobs, folding towels in a motel, sweeping floors at a bakery, saving coins in a jar that I labeled "for a room of my own." The small things mattered: a landlord who did not steal heat, a friend who lent an umbrella and did not ask for repayment. I met Marcos at a library program where he came to volunteer to teach reading to people my age who had missed school. He had the soft precision of someone who listens to commas in sentences. He laughed in an easy way, and he remembered my name. Marcos was not a savior. He had none of the dramatic rescue fantasies that make movies. He was a man who put his cups in the sink and remembered to call when he said he would. He defended me on a cold January night when a man in a bar slurred a question about my past. He took my hand when a nurse at an appointment asked if I had support. Marcos learned slowly how to hold my difficult days. He never asked me to compress myself into anything neat. He learned how to be present in the fog of trauma without trying to be everything that could cure it. We married in a small ceremony under the pines in Maple Hollow. Ellen stood to my left, proud and tired in equal measure. Detective Harris came with a congratulatory nod, which felt strange and tender all at once. My mother could not be there. She was still in the program. We invited the boy from the mill and the postman who had tipped his hat. We brought pies from a bakery we could afford. It was not a fairy tale celebration, there were small things missing, but it was honest and held in a circle of people who had chosen to be present. We had children. Giving birth felt like entering a room where you do not know the names on the backs of the chairs. I was suddenly responsible for small breathing bodies who trusted me to keep things away. It was terrifying in ways I had not expected. But it was also reclamation. I made promises in quiet noises each night when the house slept. Not the big rhetorical promises, but the practical vows. I would not sell them. I would not trade them for comfort. I would learn, if I had to, how to be available in ways my mother had not been able to be. Parenthood forced me to learn a language of safety. I learned to say things out loud that I had kept secret. When my daughter, soft and fierce, asked about where she came from, I told her age-appropriate truths. I told stories about small kindnesses and about the women who had helped us. I taught her to name her body parts and to say no, loud enough that a stranger would hear. Teaching safety felt like a reweaving of a net where the holes were smaller and the ropes stronger. There were difficult seasons. The legal threads reappeared with a case that dragged on with appeals and countersuits. Some people disagreed with the verdict. Some wrote things about families on social media in tones that made fear bloom in my chest. There were times when I had to go back to court to testify again, this time as a grown woman with kids in the back seat, wearing a jacket that hid the freckles from gardening. Each time I walked through that courthouse, my hands found ways to steady themselves. The judge would give a look that was human, neither saint nor tyrant, and I started to understand the law as a tool that could blunt, not erase, harm. At one of those hearings, the defense called my mother to the stand. We sat facing one another with years layered between us like thin glass panes. She had been through programs and time and the slow chisel of consequences. She looked older in a way I had not wanted to know she could. When she spoke, her voice was the voice of someone who had spent years learning how to be small. "I was lost," she said. "I was in so much pain. It would have been easy to let the argument dissolve into rhetoric about addiction and poverty, but I wanted to know, in plain words, what she had thought of while she wrapped a coat around my back. So I asked, 'Did you think of me at all?' She looked at me then with a kind of feral honesty that was both raw and thin. 'Yes,' she said. 'I thought of you like the thing you are, my child. I thought if I could pay something, the hunger would stop. I thought I could fix us.' That honesty did not lessen the price. It was a fact placed like a stone on a table. The court did not tell me how to feel about compassion one minute and accountability the next. It simply allowed both existences to be true in the same room. When she left the stand, an older woman in the public gallery stood up and approached us. She had been one of the neighbors who had looked away for years. Her hands were knotted with the labor of a life. "I should have said something sooner," she told me. And then she sat down as if the weight of her confession could not be carried in speech for long. The community around us began to shift, not overnight, but through a million small acts. A teacher who called the welfare office when they saw a child with holes in their shoes, a grocer who quietly began a food drive, neighbors who took turns bringing casseroles to families who needed time to breathe. Healing is not dramatic, it is the slow turning of small screws. In my early 20s, I started volunteer work with an organization that helped children like me. At first, it was awkward to sit in a room of those who had different scars, to try to translate my experience into language that could be helpful to others. but there is a peculiar kind of medicine in bearing witness to someone else's survival. I learned how to help write statements for court, how to make a safety plan, how to tell a child that they were believed. I learned the bureaucratic work of filing paperwork and making calls, unromantic work that makes the difference between a child being lost and a child being found. One afternoon, a mother came to the center with a child who clung to her dress like a small animal. She smelled of cigarettes and fear. The child had a copper necklace and eyes that were like mine had been. I sat with her and told her a story about running to a bridge and a woman with a blanket. She looked up at me, stunned that the story I told began with I. She began to cry, and the mother later whispered, "I didn't know how to get help." The center gave them numbers and a plan. We made calls to the hotline. We offered a place to sleep. We connected them with a lawyer who could explain the process in plain terms. It was not a single rescue. It was a series of small hands taking hold. Years later, I sat by my garden in the morning light, fingers in compost, watching a child chase a beetle across the soil. It is a strange and wonderful thing to have a life where tenderness is not always a sign of weakness, but a deliberate act of repair. My children grew and learned to be careful and brave in equal measures. They were taught to speak the names of their feelings and to ask for help. We had rituals: Sunday breakfasts, a small altar of shells and photographs in the kitchen, a ritual of planting in spring, where each person chose one thing to plant and made a small wish for its growth. I do not romanticize the ending. The people who sold me and the men who exploited children did not all vanish like ghosts at dawn. Some faced consequences, others faded into the background of our town's gossip. The complicated truth is that systems are messy, and justice is often a slow, uneven process. But there were legal outcomes, fines, mandated treatment, and for some, prison time, that created breathing room. More importantly, people who had once looked the other way found reasons not to. That shift saved more than I could count. One of the most important parts of my recovery was writing down my story, not for spectacle, not for vengeance, for proof, for keeping my version of events intact. I wrote letters to my younger self and read them aloud on nights when my memories felt too heavy to carry. I wrote witness statements for others and made sure they could be understood by a judge, by a therapist, by a child who was trying to name their fear. Storytelling became a tool, a way to hold truth in light and to invite others into the small, steady work of accountability. There was a moment many years later when I chose to meet my mother quietly outside the visiting hours and the papered room where time is measured by rules. We sat on a bench by the river, the same river that had been swollen the night I fled. She came with a shawl and a small paper bag that held nothing in particular. She said, "I didn't know how to stop." I said, "Maybe you didn't." We both looked at the river, and a long silence sat between us that was not empty, but full of the weight of what we had been through. I told her honestly, "You hurt me, you sold me." She nodded, and her eyes filled with a kind of shame that had teeth. I asked her if she had ever thought of the life she was forging with that coin. She said she had, and that it had been a blind calculation in a dark place. I did not forgive her then. Forgiveness for me was not a single ceremony but a long weathering. Over time there were visits where we spoke of small things, recipes, a stubborn tomato plant, and there were times when she said nothing, and her presence was a reminder of a wound that had not closed. I set boundaries that kept my children safe. I spoke to her once about the language I would allow in our house. I told her, firmly but not cruelly, that she could be present, but not in ways that harmed us. Those boundaries were my protection, and part of the work of learning to be an adult who had the duty of guarding her family. There are practical things I want anyone listening to remember. If you are in a situation where a child is being taken advantage of, try to document everything you can in small, ordinary ways: dates, receipts, names, notes. If you can, take photographs in a way that does not put the child at risk. Keep a journal. If you have a stranger who offers help, write down the name and the car type, but always prioritize safety. Reach out to local advocates and hotlines, people who know the law and can hold your hand through the forms and the slow talk of bureaucracy. In the description below, we've included numbers and resources: the National Human Trafficking Hotline, 1-888-373-788, and the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline, 1-800-4-A-CHILD, 1-800-422-4453 are two places to start if you're in the U.S. Local organizations can often connect you to shelters and counseling. Do not try to carry everything alone. If you are a neighbor and you suspect something, the small acts matter. Make a call, leave a note for an advocacy group, bring a casserole. You'd be surprised how often a stranger's casserole is the bridge between silence and intervention. If you are a professional who comes across a child in need, teacher, nurse, postal worker, know the reporting channels and be willing to use them. The world needs more people who will make the uncomfortable phone call. I tell this story not to expose wounds for the sake of spectacle, but because we are a species that heals in community. The people who helped me did not do heroic things all at once. They did small, consistent acts. Ellen's hot tea, the detective's notebook, the boy who slipped me the note. Those acts saved me. They, in turn, inspired me to do the same for others. Now, when I sit on my porch with the geraniums in chipped pots and a cup of coffee that is too strong for most palates, I watch my grandchildren chase the beetle across the soil. They pick marigolds and shove them into their pockets like good luck. I think sometimes about the night on the bridge and how different my life could have been. I say all of this to remind you that survival is not only possible, but often born of the smallest resistances and the slow work of people who will not look away. If this story has touched you, please check the links in the description. You'll find hotlines and organizations that can help, plus resources on how to document and report abuse safely. Share this video with someone who needs to hear they are not alone. Tell them that the world has people who care, and that there are systems, imperfect, clumsy but existing, that can be turned toward justice. I will end where I began, with the smell of coffee and the small garden that a woman who once was sold now tends. The pots are chipped, the geraniums bloom irregularly, and that is precisely the point. Beauty does not require perfection. It requires hands willing to get dirty. It requires people who will stand quiet and still long enough to let green grow again. You are not a story to be used. You are someone who deserves witness, protection, and a chance to grow. If you are in immediate danger, please call your local emergency number. If you need support, check the description for hotlines and organizations that can help you make a safety plan and connect you to legal and therapeutic assistance. And if you believe survivors and want more stories like this, stories of survival, of holding on, of rebuilding, subscribe and share. Keep these voices alive so that the bridge we build is stronger for the children who will cross it after us.